my technology working there? Right. So within A Course in Miracles, the theme, there are two themes that are opposites to each other. One we talked about in chapter 3 is innocence and innocent perception, which is the goal of this course. The opposite of innocence is guilt. And so the course points us towards salvation, which is belief in a guiltless world. But that's not the starting point for the ego. The starting point for the ego is one of separation and guilt, our focus this evening. So this is central to the religion, the narrative of the ego is separation and guilt. And therefore, it is threaded into everything the ego does. I can't emphasize that enough. Anything the ego does has guilt associated with it, but you may not be aware of it, but it's there just the same. And hopefully in our reading tonight, you become more aware of how this guilt acts. So we will be reading from chapter 5, section 5. The title is The Ego's Use of Guilt. Think of it just in the title. The ego is going to use guilt to achieve its own purposes and its own ends. And we have unconsciously participated in that. And the learning here is to see how the ego uses guilt, recognize it. Oh, that's been going on all the time. I didn't know. But now I'm choosing innocence instead, and learning to shift out of the guilty patterns. So that'll be our topic today. This is, by the way, we are introducing, I think this is the most introduction to guilt we've seen so far in the textbook, but it will be covered many, many times because, as I said, everything the ego does involves guilt. So we can't talk about the ego without referring to its use of guilt. And I want to thank our sister Julie C., who has agreed to be our reader for this evening. Thank you, Julie.
Perhaps some of our concepts will become clearer and more personally meaningful if the ego's use of guilt is clarified. The ego has a purpose, just as the Holy Spirit has. The ego's purpose is fear, because only the fearful can be egotistic. The ego's logic is as impeccable as that of the Holy Spirit, because your mind has the means at its disposal to side with heaven or earth as it elects. But again, remember that both are in you.
Remember that both heaven and earth are in you. And then it comes down to your willing, what are you willing to bring forth in your life, heaven or earth? Now, those are symbols, heaven or earth. We could substitute love or fear, and use many other symbols, innocence or guilt. Which of them are you going to apply your mind to focusing on and bringing forth in your life? So we want to clarify the ego's use of guilt. It is largely unconscious We are seeking to make it conscious now. So for many people, this will not be a pleasant uncovering of to realize, oh, I've been participating in ego's use of guilt unconsciously in many ways throughout my life. So it's not necessarily complimentary. However, it is the path to freeing ourselves from being in a culture of guilt and freeing ourselves out of that into a culture of innocence. Also, one more thing that is, I think this is the only mention of it, maybe one or two other places. The ego has a thought system that begins with fear and guilt, and then it builds logically on fear and guilt into an entire framework, an entire worldview. And it is logical. If you're willing to start with fear and guilt, then the ego's thought system makes sense. However, the foundation of fear and guilt do not make sense. They are insane to build a thought system on fear and guilt, and therefore the whole thought system does not make sense. But it is logical, and this is one of the reasons why many people have tolerated it for so long, because once you get wrapped inside that thought system, it would seem to be consistent with itself. And so just realize that it has, if it has any appeal at all, it's because it remains largely consistent within itself. Its ego's logic is impeccable. Okay, welcome friends from around the world.
In heaven, there is no guilt, because the kingdom is attained through atonement, which releases you to create. The word create is appropriate here, because once what you have made is undone by the Holy Spirit, the blessed residue is restored and therefore continues in creation. What is truly blessed is incapable of giving rise to guilt and must give rise to joy. This makes it invulnerable to the ego because its peace is unassailable. It is invulnerable to disruption because it is whole. Guilt is always disruptive. Anything that engenders fear is divisive because it obeys the law of division. If the ego is the symbol of the separation, it is also the symbol of guilt. Guilt is more than merely not of God. It is the symbol of attack on God. This is a totally meaningless concept except to the ego, but do not underestimate the power of the ego's belief in it. This is the belief from which all guilt really stems.
Mm-hmm. So the second half of this, we're going to spend a few minutes on because it's so central. But before we tackle that, let me just make a brief comment about this being invulnerable to the ego. A Course in Miracles teaches that when God created you and I and everyone else, the essence of our being is eternal, changeless, and cannot be destroyed or impaired by ego or time and space or mistakes. The essence of your spiritual being, which is love and peace and joy, cannot be destroyed. It is invulnerable to time and space. Now, your mind may get confused regarding these matters, but your being never changes. Therefore, we use the term invulnerable in a course to refer to the truth of your being, your essence, your spirit, which God created. It is invulnerable. And at the same time, the things that the ego makes of you, its narrative, its story line, are very vulnerable to the truth. If you shine the light of truth on the ego's errors, they collapse. So they are vulnerable. So that's how we use that term. And it's used differently elsewhere in other programs. So we're not commenting on other programs. We are commenting on how those two symbols of vulnerability and invulnerability are used here. Your spirit is invulnerable. Okay. Whereas guilt, now we'll go on to the second half. Guilt is a thought and feeling that is very disruptive. It is like quicksand. And guilt obeys the laws of division. Did you know there were laws of division? That you can think of them as psychic laws that once you may engage in them without realizing, once your mind enters into the space where it's all divided, then your attention will obey the laws of division. And it can be very chaotic in there. So we need to learn to watch our mind, be sensitive to those movements into division, and quickly choose again to withdraw ourselves from those engagements. So let's make the major point then. The ego is the symbol of guilt. Ego is symbolized, represented by the thought feeling of guilt. And in fact, this word guilt, we're going to define not according to the dictionary, but according to its role in the separation. So we're giving a radical redefinition to the term guilt, distinguishing it from conventional use. Guilt is the symbol for the attack on God's plan for creation. Guilt says, not interested in God's plan for creation, got my own agenda, got a better idea for myself, I'm separating from it, and going to be in opposition to God's plan. Now, that idea is pretty insane, to be in opposition to the Creator's plan. Well, where are you going to go? How are you going to make that work? It's a meaningless concept, except to the ego. But even though the concept is meaningless, do not underestimate the strength with which the ego believes that it can attack God's plan, usurp his plan, stand in opposition for it. So here we go. This is the point that I would hope you would take notes on. Where does guilt come from? Guilt comes from the ego's plan to usurp the power of God, to attack it, to use a metaphor, to dethrone God from his position as God and make the ego your God. That's where guilt comes from. So we can say this in many different ways and different words, but it is let's see, is displacement the right word? Yes. The role that God has in your life, the ego would displace and put itself in that role. And guilt comes about as a result of that error, of that mistake. So now we've redefined guilt, not according to what the dictionary may say, like I broke a moral code or a commandment, or I broke the wishes of my parents. You might find that in the dictionary. What we're talking about here is an existential concept, a concept that pervades time and all of time and space, that existed long before you were born. It was the idea of disrupting God's plan. And when you were born, you learned these things and acquired these beliefs unconsciously, then started to adopt them as your own. And now we're undoing that process, that mistake. Noel?
So does guilt come from the ego's recognition that it's, quote, trying to usurp God or doing something wrong?
Essentially, yes. Yes. Something so grandiose as I'm going to dethrone God and make myself God, even the ego realizes that's a tall order. Now it's and therefore has trouble with that idea. Okay, Richard?
Hi, guys. I'm feeling very vulnerable right now, and I've been for the last week or so, last lesson, and this is just complementing it. I'm feeling a lot of shame, and does that fall under the ego's umbrella? Also, I'm in a 12-step program, and I've been doing well for over 30 years. And looking at myself and my motives for even entering a program, I know this is a question, I'm not trying to set anybody up. I feel that this is sabotaging and I know it's not true, it's sabotaging my whole attempt over 30 years of being in that program and doing okay. But this work is completely foreign to my original motives.
Yes.
That kept me clean and sober and
Right.
Whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And it's like, oh God, another hurdle, man.
Another hurdle, right.
So I'm walking around feeling vulnerable. I'm interacting with people, and it's cool, but it's completely foreign to me. And my ego says, man, you got to get out of here right away.
Right, right. Yeah, I really appreciate your sharing that, Richard, sharing your vulnerability there. But let me say on your behalf, all the work that you had done up until now prepares you for this next step that the course is offering. People that are okay, I won't comment on other people, but Richard, you have laid a foundation in your life of commitment to your sobriety and to the steps and to the practice. Those things are strengths, and you can transfer those strengths into this program. So yes, there is a choice That is to move forward and progress further, or you could choose not to and just remain where you are with what you've already learned. So that's a choice. And the reason why you're here feeling that vulnerability is that you're choosing to move forward into a zone that is not well familiar to you, and it's not well familiar to any of us. So you are surrounded by people that know exactly what that feels like.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me take one more comment. You're welcome, my brother. Noel?
I'd like to ask Richard, why does he feel the course is sabotaging the 12-step, or is it? I kind of thought they dovetail, they complement each other.
Yeah, so actually, I want to I want to defer that till overtime, because now we're talking about other programs, and this one, I don't want to use our time to comment so much, but we can talk about it afterwards. Okay. All right. So the symbol of guilt, the ego's symbol is one of guilt, and the meaning of it here is an attack, a direct attack upon God. Heidi?
Hi, everybody. I don't know if this will help Richard or not, but my experience of the Course of Miracles, I now know that when I'm in a funk or feeling vulnerable or knowing that my ego is trying to take over, it's right before I have an aha moment and grow. So I now am able to realize that it's okay where I'm at. It's okay that I'm feeling this, because God has bigger and better on the way. And I just hang in there until it passes. And as long as I recognize it, it makes it a lot easier to get through. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that is so true. Thank you, Heidi, for adding that. It is true that those moments that might feel like ego temptation are also an invitation or a call from the Holy Spirit to make a better choice. And that can result in a breakthrough for you. So get used to it and learn that you can always choose the higher way. That's what this program is. The choices will always remain in front of you, but you learn that you are not bound to choosing the ego's path, that you can choose again and follow the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Thank you for that, Heidi. Okay, by the way, there's not a lot of material here, but this really hits deep. So let me underscore it again. All of us, you were born into a world that believes in guilt. You were enculturated and taught to think in terms of that you are not good enough, not lovable, not perfect in the eyes of God, but flawed, sinful, guilty. You were born into a thought system that teaches you that. And so it has worked its way into our thought habits and patterns in ways that we don't really understand. But now we are beginning to expose those matters, and the ability to become free of guilt is perhaps one of the greatest gifts that this program offers. I can't think of anything that I would put above that. Freedom from guilt. All right, so we'll go on.
The ego is the part of the mind that believes in division. How could part of God detach itself without believing it is attacking him? We spoke before of the authority problem as based on the concept of usurping God's power. The ego believes that this is what you did because it believes that it is you. If you identify with the ego, you must perceive yourself as guilty. Whenever you respond to your ego, you will experience guilt and you will fear punishment. The ego is quite literally a fearful thought. However ridiculous the idea of attacking God may be to the sane mind, never forget that the ego is not sane. It represents a delusional system and speaks for it. Listening to the ego's voice means that you believe it is possible to attack God and that a part of him has been torn away by you. Fear of retaliation from without follows because the severity of the guilt is so acute that it must be protected.
Mhm. So this is so central, but not easy to appreciate fully the first time through. So therefore, we're spend some moments in trying to understand it more. So there's this concept, this crazy idea of attacking God that belongs to the ego. And that idea gets diluted down into many different forms such that you would never recognize that's what's going on. But it is true that whenever you listen to the ego's voice, it implies that you found a better voice to listen to than the one of the Holy Spirit. In other words, there's always a choice. And if you embrace the ego's voice, unconsciously or consciously, you've elected that for yourself. And so it means that you believe that it is possible for you to separate and that part of God has been torn away by you. I'm just presenting the concept here. It believes that part of God has been torn away, and you have this section of your mind that can be guided by the ego that has its own private kingdom, its own separate reality, apart from the master plan, the plan that includes everyone. Now, you don't consciously realize that, but unconsciously, it's an election to pursue that as your guide. And it has consequences. This is a part that it was very profound for me to when I realized the truth of this, but it's a deeply buried psychological condition that when you listen to the ego's voice, it means you have chosen not to listen to the voice for truth. And that invokes a sense of fear in you, a sense of retaliation for making such a choice. And you will feel guilty for those feelings. There are people trying to enter into the meeting here, and I've decided not to allow them in, so I'm a little distracted here. So when you make that choice, it brings about guilt in your mind because you are afraid of the consequences of having chose against God. And that guilt, this is the key point, that guilt is so, it's almost down at the level of your soul, not at the level of your conscious mind. That guilt is so sharp, so acute, that your mind wants to get rid of it immediately and project it outward, away from yourself, so that everyone else appears as guilty instead. Now, I know if you haven't encountered this idea before, it might not be obvious right away, but let's say it again. When we join with the ego, it creates a sense of fear and a sharp sense of this can't be the right thing to do. And that guilt is so strong that you won't tolerate living with it in your mind. And so the mind then attempts to project it outward onto individuals and onto the world. And Heather, this is the source of the evil world theory, the theory that out there is an evil world. And it comes about because we have projected our own guilt outward. So it's and psychologically, this appears like a generalized free-floating anxiety. You can wake up in the morning and there's nothing particularly different about it than any other morning, and just be anxious, a generalized fear, and that becomes misinterpreted by believing I must be fearful or anxious for a reason. Reality itself must be fearful. So this is the trap that the ego engages in, and a great deal of the mental disorders that people have stem from not understanding this source of guilt and this anxiety, and our own role. Here's the thing, it comes from not understanding that our own mind has somehow participated in this mistake and therefore is the cause of the anxiety and the fear and the guilt. Heidi?
Yeah, I had an experience last night from like, I don't know, 2 a.m. till 6 a.m, where my brain was on the hamster wheel and I was feeling guilt and anxiety and, you know, everything that goes along with the ego. And then I realized what I need to do is kill the ego with kindness. And the Holy Spirit came in, and the first thing I decided to do was acknowledge the ego and let it know I knew what it was trying to do. And aha, I know you're trying to do this and it's not going to happen. I love you for trying, but it's time to go away. And I think the more I acknowledge the ego instead of fighting it or being afraid of it, and the more I loved it through the Holy Spirit, happier isn't the word, the more clarity I had in my brain, which really helped because there's only fear or love. And if I stay with fear and my ego, then that's where I'm going to be. So I went to my ego with love, and it worked. It was really good.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that, Victory. Okay, I know this concept that we just went over might not be the type of idea that you're familiar with. This is why I prefer to refer to this guilt as existential guilt. It has existential, it has to do with the nature of your being. And it's an error. It's the ego's use of existential guilt. It's an error in believing that you are fundamentally in opposition to God and therefore should be afraid, should feel guilty, and then adopting that as the basis for your worldview. So one more critical point is when A Course in Miracles refers to the world, of which it will do so hundreds of times, we mean the ego's view of the world, which is what I just described, a world that arises from a fundamental existential guilt that we are in opposition to God's plan and therefore permanently in a state of fear and acute anxiety and guilt because of that opposition. That is the world that the ego has made. It's not a planet. It's a perception, an interpretation, a view, of mistaken view that life is inherently fearful. And as it points out here so well, that this idea that originates in one's own mind because of mistaken choosing to listen to the ego's voice is so uncomfortable, it has to be projected outside of your mind onto the world. That's how it becomes a worldview, is no one wants to think of this as true of themselves, therefore it gets projected outward. So it's a psychological attribute to which causes untold suffering with people. So the picture is not from A Course in Miracles, but it is, I think, symbolic of the state of existential guilt, that there is a face within you that is very unhappy with you and frightens you. And whenever you respond to your ego, those feelings and those beliefs will arise. And this is very anxious. This is not pleasant. This is not peace. This is not innocence. This is not love. Susie?
So I just wanted to say that, when you were talking about waking up in the morning and having all those feelings, like this is, I think, the most I can be grateful for this course. I mean, I always say it's like picking a favorite child, but now that I know that there's nothing wrong with me, except for that I was following the thought system of the ego, is the greatest gift I think I could have ever received in life.
Yes.
Because I was 100% sure, is Heather on this call? I don't know.
Yes.
That there was something wrong with me. Nobody could figure it out. when I died, this truly, they were gonna find it in my brain. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I was tortured. Use that word, hell, like it says in the course. And I am just profoundly grateful. And like, I know now, I'm 100% sure that it was all my ego thoughts and that was my story and I didn't know any better. But now, if I'm ever anxious or have experienced anything, which I don't, but anything which I do remotely like that, I just turn the other cheek. And I know that it is just coming from my ego and it is not me, Susie, this whole thing that I had made up. And I also just want to say, to speak to what Heidi said, you know, I can't fight against my ego, because then if I'm fighting against it, like Heidi said, I'm doing exactly what my ego wants me to do. I stay in a state of ugh. So I just try to notice it, let it go, recognize it, and ask for help. And that helps me a whole lot more than fighting, like she said, against it, because that's what it wants me to do. Anyway, I'm grateful to know I'm not nuts.
Yes. Thank you, Susie. Appreciate your sincerity there and your sharing your experience on that. All right, we'll go on.
Whatever you accept into your mind has reality for you. It is your acceptance of it that makes it real. If you enthrone the ego in your mind, your allowing it to enter makes it your reality. This is because the mind is capable of creating reality or making illusions. I said before that you must learn to think with God. To think with him is to think like him. This engenders joy, not guilt, because it is natural. Guilt is a sure sign that your thinking is unnatural. Unnatural thinking will always be attended with guilt because it is the belief in sin. The ego does not perceive sin as a lack of love, but as a positive act of assault. This is necessary to the ego's survival, because as soon as you regard sin as a lack, you will automatically attempt to remedy the situation, and you will succeed. The ego regards this as doom, but you must learn to regard it as freedom.
Mhm. So in the previous paragraph, we read that whenever you respond to your ego, you will experience guilt and you will fear punishment. Here, it uses a different metaphor. If you enthrone the ego in your mind, you're allowing it to enter, makes it your reality. For a great many of us, it's completely unconscious, but the effect is still the same. By enthroning the ego, which is to say, being guided by the impulses and the ideas that are based on the worldview of the ego, if you are guided by that, you will elevate that thought system to be your reality. You will enthrone it. We also refer to it in other places as you will make this your idol. This will become your chief idol, to be guided by the self-talk, which, as we saw in the previous slide, is very unhappy with you, does not love you. So, and keeping you trapped in that prison cell is the chief purpose of the ego, is that you would accept your misery, accept your guilt, your anxieties, and your fears, and learn to live with it. So to speak, truly believe that this is your reality. And this is the greatest deception of them all, is that we go along with the illusion that anxiety and fear and judgment and punishment are normal and we deserve it. So, of course, this course challenges all that and would sweep all that away as nonsense and say it's simply a mistake in belief, and that the door of your prison cell is unlocked, and it requires your willingness to assert your own free will and say, I'm determined to see, I'm determined to live in the light, I'm going to choose again and let the Holy Spirit be my guide. Susan?
I just want to share something really quickly, and that was that you just said it. I have to live with this. That's what I used to hear in therapy for years. Well, you know, you just have to face this is what you're feeling. This is, I have to live with it. I mean, that's the truth. This course, and, you know, Al-Anon doing the 12 steps and all that, but this course has taught me, no, I don't have to live with it. I was living with a faulty thought system. I was living with something that was destroying me. It wasn't the experiences that destroyed me. It's what I thought was real and everything the ego was telling me about myself that was destroying me. I look at the experiences now that I thought were so traumatic and PTSD, and I know that they just were what they were. Like, only love is real. Like, okay, so that happened. I'm learning a whole new way of looking at it. I never learned anything like this in all the years and thousands of dollars in therapy. And that's not to say there aren't wonderful therapists. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying I was told, learn to live with it. So, you know, just thought I'd share that. It's so grateful that I don't have to live with it.
Indeed, it is. Wow, it's powerful. Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, hey guys, I'm a little sensitive today. I had mentioned something earlier, and I'm here in the coursework of my spiritual condition, and learning to get along not only with myself, with other people through a conscious contact. What frustrates me is when I do share something and I become vulnerable, and someone wants to fix me. It discourages me from even being here. I know the answer is in work, and there is a facilitator here that can pick up on that, which you have, and point me back into the right direction.
Okay.
The crosstalk is just, I'm afraid to share some. I don't know how to share without creating if someone's going to crosstalk, and I guess that, please don't.
Okay, very good. So I hear you. Richard's asking for a boundary when he shares on sensitive things. He's not looking for you to comment or further question those things. Does that summarize it fairly, Richard?
Well, in the particulars, not to be particular. I go to a place for help, and in passing, I didn't mention which program or what. I went there for help, and I'm here for help too. And there's a facilitator here that understands this, has done the work, and is taking me through. And I guess right now I'm living in the world of separation after hearing. Okay, and I'm here to join, so
All right, all
please
right,
bear with me.
all right.
Thank you.
We will. And thank you for us identifying the boundaries and helping clarify for them. It is helpful in the group here to be very sensitive to when we're feeding back to other people. We don't have a hard and fast rule about crosstalk, but we're trusting that you will be guided by the Holy Spirit in these matters. Okay, so let's go on. So maybe you might be feeling a little guilt now. So let's talk about the what it's like to be free of guilt. Julie?
The guiltless mind cannot suffer. Being sane, the mind heals the body because it has been healed. The sane mind cannot conceive of illness because it cannot conceive of attacking anyone or anything. I said before that illness is a form of magic. It might be better to say that it is a form of magical solution. The ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. Yet even in this, it is arrogant. It attributes to God a punishing intent, and then takes this intent as its own prerogative. It tries to usurp all the functions of God as it perceives them, because it recognizes that only total intelligence can be trusted.
Total allegiance can be trusted.
Thank you.
Mhm. Wow, this is so strong. There's not a lot of words here, but it surely says a lot. So there is the guiltless or innocent part of your mind and the guilty part of your mind. And this course requires you learn to make a distinction, and you learn to begin to distinguish when thoughts, feelings arise from the guilty part of your mind, and distinguish that from innocence. So the guiltless part of your mind cannot suffer. This is a part that's aligned with the Holy Spirit. It's sane. It heals the body because the mind has been healed, and it cannot, in fact, this part of the mind cannot conceive of illness because it can't conceive of one that is deserving of punishment. Yet the other side of the mind, now this is what we're learning today, is the ego's use of guilt. The other side of your mind, and even this session today, can be helpful for you to recognize what that other side looks like. The other side, the ego, believes in punishing itself. It has a punishing agenda, and you will feel that. Remember the Pac-Man face? That was very stern and unhappy. And it does this in relationship to its own sense of being punished by God. That's not so important to understand. Just know that it's out to punish you. It's out to make you feel badly about yourself. And however, it will it will hide its intent by deflecting that punishment onto God, your concept of God, so that you won't suspect that it was the ego that's out to punish. Instead, you'll think that reality itself, the cosmic creation, is out to punish you. That's why we call it existential guilt. It has to do with the very sense of your being in life, in the world. It's a profoundly deep confusion that now has been projected onto your concept of the creator. And so once it does that, we enter into the idea of the fear of God. And we will mention it many times in passing, but we will deal with it in detail in chapter 19, the obstacles to peace. It's the foundation of the ego's worldview is to have you fear God. And that includes, I won't mention any names here, but that includes anyone who's raised in any system where the idea of God or any kind of religious system is there's an alienation towards the idea of a source, a creator. There's a rejection of that. Has to do with projecting onto the concept of a creator the sense of punishment and fear, and therefore wanting nothing to do with such a fearful God. These are widespread beliefs in the 20th century. These threads of the fear of a punishing God operates very broadly here in our era. Julie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, there are some central themes for me in my like mid-adulthood here, and certainly coming to grips with this one has been huge. In this moment, it's almost impossible for me to believe that I don't live in that world because it's such a big ask to be able to conceive that all of the parts of who I think I am are not bound by that rule structure. And when I think about my experience of mental health, it is entirely rooted by that as one of the anchor points, entirely. Because, you know, as a small person, the humans who were older and adults or whatever, you know, they were the ones who were handing out the commandments, right? So then there's also the religious institution in which I was raised, which I'm grateful for, which has a lot of great messages. But that's the other anchor point of that. And trying to negotiate that with the, I know it's an illusion, but with the illusory experience of how it feels to be me is a real head spin. And the course is a great, great tool for this.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for your clarity and articulateness on that, Julie. And it is true that no one would want to undertake this journey without the Holy Spirit as guide, and because it is a big head spin for people, and you could not do this alone and by oneself. No one ever suggested you do this by yourself. So thank you for your honesty on that. Noelle?
I'd like to go to the the fourth sentence down. The ego believes that by punishing itself, it will mitigate the punishment of God. Is this like, I'll get there and reject you before you reject me, or I'll punish you before you punish me?
It may be. I don't have any. Okay, so let's read the line after that. Even in this, it is arrogant For in other words, it's really about control. The ego wants to be the one to set the agenda here. And so it wants to, it believes, or it would have you believe that God is out to punish you. Therefore, but that would give God some credit, if you will, in an insane kind of way. So therefore it rushes in to be the one to do the punishing itself because it wants to, because it's arrogant. It wants to be the one to deal out this punishment. It will attribute to God a punishing intent and then takes this intent as its own point of control. In fact, there's a broader pattern here that is abstract and it's hard, but it's important, Noel, to recognize. The ego wants to usurp all the functions of God, whether that be punishment or anything else. The ego wants to be enthroned in your mind to take on those roles. So in this is just one example where if there's going to be any punishment done, let the ego wants to be the one to do it. If there's going to be any description of the world, the ego wants to be the one to do it. I'm going to sound like a broken record here. If there's going to be any understanding of love, the ego wants to be the one to help explain it to you. If there's going to be any relationship with other people, the ego wants to be the one to describe how that will work. If there's going to be any guilt, the ego wants to be the one to describe how the laws of guilt work, etc. You get the pattern there. It wants to usurp and be in control and direct your mind. And if you're unconscious, you'll just drift into that without realizing it, as we all have done. Okay, I told you this was profound and deep.
The ego,
Actually, I'm sorry. Thank you, Julie. But let's take a comment from Susie.
I think, will you just go back to that last paragraph?
Surely.
Because it's just, for me, I can sum that up in like that the ego wants me to believe that I can only trust in what the direction it's giving me, that I cannot have faith in what the Holy Spirit might be able to do for me. Oh no, the ego wants total allegiance because it, I mean, that just makes so much sense to me. Because if I don't trust in the ego, it is totally threatened. So, I know this from personal experience too. Don't trust in what they're telling you. That could never happen. That can't be. So that's kind of what that sentence speaks to for me.
Yeah, very good. Well said. By the way, I just based on what Susie just shared, this whole confusion, then if each one of us, our understanding of what it means to trust, the ego wants to teach you what it means to trust. It wants to set the terms of trust. So can you see how it starts to thread into just about every aspect of your life if you're unconsciously allow the ego to guide you? It will certainly and gladly give you its religion. It will gladly usurp the functions that should be given to the Holy Spirit. It will gladly take on that role. And thus, a confusion of trust becomes central. We're going to deal with this later. I hadn't intended to bring it up, but the whole having an ego's view of trust, which is upside down view of trust, has to be corrected. And those of you that have read the teacher's manual know that the characteristics of God's teachers is founded on the correction of trust, of the reinterpretation and the repurposing of your sense of trust away from what the ego would teach and into what the Holy Spirit would teach. So we're not going to cover that today, but that ties directly into this confusion that was written about here. All right, we need to go on.
The ego cannot oppose the laws of God any more than you can, but it can interpret them according to what it wants, just as you can. That is why the question, what do you want, must be answered. You are answering it every minute and every second, and each moment of decision is a judgment that is anything but ineffectual. Its effects will follow automatically until the decision is changed. Remember, though, that the alternatives themselves are unalterable. The Holy Spirit, like the ego, is a decision. Together, they constitute all the alternatives the mind can accept and obey. The Holy Spirit and the ego are the only choices open to you. God created one, and so you cannot eradicate it. You made the other, and so you can. Only what God creates is irreversible and unchangeable. What you made can always be changed, because when you do not think like God, you are not really thinking at all. Delusional ideas are not real thoughts, although you can believe in them, but you are wrong. The function of thought comes from God and is in God. As part of his thought, you cannot think apart from him.
So we said a moment ago that there is an innocent part of your mind and a guilty part. That's fixed in the nature of our condition at this time, that there would be those two things. So, and there are messages coming from each part of your mind. From the innocent part of your mind, the holy part of your mind, and from the guilty part. So the alternatives themselves are unalterable. You can't change that. The two choices constitute all the alternatives that the mind can accept and obey. And so it's not that complicated. It's either the guilty mind or the innocent mind. So that is favorable. And the one, the sane part of your mind, the innocent part we read before, never changes. It is constant and stable. We say it's quiet and at peace. It's perfect. So it's highly reliable. It is not vulnerable. It is invulnerable. And so its attributes are in every respect completely opposite from the guilty part of your mind. Now, having said that, every minute and every second and in each moment of decision, you're being guided by one part of your mind or another. None of us can get away from that. You're being guided The only part you can do is make a conscious choice of who you want to be your guide. If you want to consciously welcome the Holy Spirit to guide you, or if you want to unconsciously just go with whatever pops in your, whatever happens to you without any decision on your part. Those are the only two choices. Therefore, one of the central themes is to ask yourself, what is it you want to do with yourself in this situation? Do you want to be guided by the Holy Spirit, or do you want to choose your own way? And what we're just suggesting is that you make a mantra, you mind watch. What is it that I want to do? What is it? Which source, part of me, do I want to be my guide? Because it is certain that one or the other will be your guide in every decision that you make. Now, having said that, this is why a quiet mind is so comforting. Because can you imagine all day long having to be aware of which part of my mind is guiding me? That could be an arduous process, to say the least. Every decision you make to be alert. No one can watch their mind all the time. Therefore, entering into that meeting place that is quiet and restful, where there's not, where the chatter stops and you can just rest and be, is a wonderfully refreshing space. I mean, the appeal, talk about falling in love with the Spirit's gifts, that can be your gift to yourself at any time. This is why the current workbook lessons, 106 or whatever one you happen to be on, say take 5 minutes every hour. You know, make this a habit. Make this a normal to yourself to take some time to be at peace and at quiet. So, and in our modern era, that is moving in the exact opposite way of getting overstimulated with constant activity, becoming addicted to activity. So this is a way of countering that culture of being busy all the time. Let's go on. Okay, so we just said that you're really only thinking when you share with God's mind, that when your attention is preoccupied with the ego, you're not really thinking at all. You're in some kind of crazy state. Julie?
Irrational thought is disordered thought. God himself orders your thought because your thought was created by him. Guilt feelings are always a sign that you do not know this. They also show that you believe you can think apart from God and want to. Every disordered thought is intended by guilt at its inception and maintained by guilt in its continuance. Guilt is inescapable by those who believe they order their own thoughts and must therefore obey their dictates. This makes them feel responsible for their errors without recognizing that by accepting this responsibility, they are reacting irresponsibly. If the sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for himself, and I assure you that it is, then the responsibility for what is atoned for cannot be yours. The dilemma cannot be resolved except by accepting the solution of undoing. You would be responsible for the effects of all your wrong thinking if it could not be undone. The purpose of the atonement is to save the past in purified form only. If you accept the remedy for disordered thought, a remedy whose efficacy is beyond doubt, how can its symptoms remain?
How can its symptoms remain? So this paragraph is one that you really need to read again and again and pause on it. I'm going to go over it here in some depth because this really gets the message across. So let's talk about the easy part. We're going to have, in describing thoughts, on one end of the spectrum, we're going to call it disordered thoughts, irrational thoughts. And on the other end of the spectrum, we're going to talk about orderly thoughts, rational thoughts, which are loving thoughts based on reality. So, and there's two parts of your mind. So one's going to be in the disordered thought state, and the other is going to be in the orderly or rational part. And you can learn to recognize when your mind is in one of those two states. I am confident all of you can learn to say, just ask yourself, are my thoughts disordered right now? Or are they orderly and peaceful and calm? You can learn to recognize that. It won't take you years and years of learning. So orderly versus disorderly. And when your thoughts are disordered, it's sure that there's guilt floating around in that thought train. Every disordered thought is attended by guilt at its inception. So the disordered thought begins with guilt and is maintained by guilt as long as it continues on. That's a law of guilt. Is guilt begins a disordered thought, leads to disordered thought, and guilt maintains the thought. So here is what I think to be the most profound statement. How is it that these things are occurring? I'm going to speak first person. How is it that this guilt continues to plague me, even though I may have read these things? Well, guilt is inescapable by those who believe they are in control of their own thoughts. Guilt is inescapable when I believe that I'm in control of my own thoughts. Because after all, the choices are to be guided by the Holy Spirit or to be guided by my disordered thoughts. Which one am I in control of? Which part of me attempts to usurp and enthrone myself as being the leader and director? The guilty part. When in opposition to that, when I join with the Holy Spirit, I know I'm not in control. I know that she's got the loving guiding hand and that I'm the recipient of the voice of God. I relinquish control in the hands of the Holy Spirit. But when I go into disordered thought, I attempt to be the one to be in control and order my own thoughts. And you can learn to detect this in yourself. This is not, it's subtle for sure, but are you in control or have you invited the Holy Spirit to guide you? It's that simple. So, very profound. The theory can be explained in 2 minutes, but you're practicing it in your private moments is where you will have the experience that will free you. You must be willing to pause long enough and ask yourself, what is it that I want right now? Do I want to be in control or do I want to host the Holy Spirit? What is it that I want? And so if you attempt to be in control, you will, let's go on and then we'll take some comments. If you attempt to dictate your own thoughts, you will feel responsible for your errors. And as a result of accepting this responsibility, you will feel like you are the guilty one for this. And that is an error. That is a trap. That will keep you locked in the ego's prison cell. I'm responsible for my own thoughts. I'm the one who made the mistake. I have to pay the price. Guilt, guilt, guilt. It's a trap. So here's the way out. And this is incredible. I really hope you'll spend time with this. If the sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for himself, and I assure you the sole responsibility is to accept the atonement for himself, then the responsibility for the error cannot be yours. Meaning that I trust the Holy Spirit for the answer. I acknowledge my mistakes, and I gladly and willingly and humbly hand those mistakes to the Holy Spirit, trusting that the answers will come from her, not from my disordered thought mind system. So that the responsibility for the answer must be hers. It appears as a dilemma in your mind. Who's responsible for your errors? The dilemma cannot be resolved except by accepting the solution of undoing, which is the atonement. You cannot do this by yourself. It's a dilemma. It's a trap. You will forever feel that you're responsible for your own mistakes and therefore feel guilty and locked into the ego's mindset. And you would be responsible for the effects of your wrong thinking if they could not be undone. You wouldn't, if you were by yourself and separate, you would have to live with those mistakes. But the purpose of the atonement is to only save the past in purified form, not save the errors of the past. And if you can accept that the atonement is the remedy for all your mistakes, for all your disordered thought, then its symptoms cannot remain. Said another way, if you can learn to trust the Holy Spirit for the answer, then the guilt and the effects of your mistakes cannot go unresolved. The Holy Spirit is your guarantee that she will guide you and answer you and help you to undo this trap of guilt. Heather?
I love this. I love that line though. The purpose of the atonement is to save the past in purified form only. And I love it because it reminds me that only the Holy Spirit's version of the past is going to be the purified, which is the purified form, not my version, my narrative, not my telling about how the story was. It's the Holy Spirit's repurposing of that whole past idea. That's the only form that's going to be it, because it's the only form that's real. So I just love that. It's not the past just goes away. It's we remember, but we remember it in the purified form. So I love that. It's complete transference of all of our story into something that is now a purified form, and it doesn't look anything like the original story.
Very well said, Heather. Thank you so much for that share. It really does hit the nail right on the head. So let's just, because it's so important, sorry to belabor the point, but what the ego would have you do is continue to suffer from your responsibility for errors that you had made in the past, and to become completely preoccupied with that as your narrative, and lost in your past errors. What this program is offering you is a way out, the undoing. The atonement is the undoing of these past errors, not by you, but by you giving them to the Holy Spirit. And it's a transfer of responsibility for the answer, for the solution, into her hands. And then you need do nothing but listen for guidance. And for a control freak, which is what the ego is, this is not easy to transfer responsibility into the hands of some being that you can't see or control. This is a major trust factor. Again, characteristics of God's teachers is founded on trust. We are transferring responsibility from our own guilt-ridden self into the hands of the Holy Spirit and trusting her to purify the past errors so that only that which is good is saved. It's you cannot make this stuff up. Only a loving creator could come up with a solution so elegant that God promises everything, you do nothing but be willing to reassign your guilt and your sense of false responsibility, reassign that into the hands of the Holy Spirit and let her be guide. If you can accept this remedy, then the symptoms of suffering and pain, the life narrative that I must be something wrong with me, I don't deserve love, however the words are expressed, those symptoms cannot remain. So I'm running over time here, but we only have a few lines to go. And Julie?
The continuing decision to remain separated is the only possible reason for continuing guilt feelings. We have said this before, but did not emphasize the destructive results of the decision. Any decision of the mind will affect both behavior and experience. What you want, you expect. This is not delusional. Your mind does make your future, and it will turn it back to full creation at any minute if it accepts the atonement first. It will also return to full creation the instant it has done so. Having given up its disordered thought, the proper ordering of thought becomes quite apparent.
So the aspect that I was going to emphasize here is brought out many places in the course. It's about cause and effect within your mind. The cause is the decision that your mind makes. Your mind makes a choice to be guided by the Holy Spirit or not to bother checking in and just wing it on your own. It's a decision of the mind will affect both behavior and your experience. And we read earlier that you're doing this all the time, every hour or every moment is going to affect how you feel. And this will determine your experience in this process, in this journey. So the solution then here is to trust in the atonement, to accept the atonement is the plan for healing the entire sonship. You are a part of a cosmic plan of healing. Your part matters, very much matters, and it has implications for many others as well. But it all begins with your accepting that union of your mind with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It all begins there. And without that beginning, we simply follow the ego's use of guilt and think ourselves to be in control of our own thoughts. So there you have it, the ego's use of guilt. It is a central theme to which we will return again and again. And so there's more to be said, but this is the foundation. We've identified the source there, and it has many, the use of guilt has many branches on it, which will be covered later on, but we can't do all that in one night. I think this was good for one session. I want to thank you all for your attention. Noel and Julie, if you could hang on a few minutes afterwards, I wanted to follow up with you. Thank you, Julie, for reading. Thank you all for your attention. It is definitely, the rains have returned to South Florida. It's coming down in buckets right now. So if you're out on the road at all tonight, please drive carefully. Thank you all. Namaste. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody.
Thank you,
Love you
Julie.
all.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you all.